My name is Josh Corey, and for the past 4 years, I have been the pastor of the church that I'm standing in right now as I make this tape for you, Trinity United Methodist Church in Amarillo, Texas. Now, when I first arrived at Trinity, it was such an exciting time in my life because it was my first appointment as a pastor, and I had been preparing for years. I'd been studying and gone to seminary, and finally I had reached this goal, and I was able to start what I perceived as my calling here at the church as a pastor. Now, at the same time that it was very exciting, it was also an incredibly intimidating and stressful time in my life all at the same time. And the reason was very simple. I was in charge. This had never happened to me before. I was the one who had to preach every Sunday. If someone got sick or needed care, or if the church needed leadership, it was my responsibility. And to top it all off, we had 5 longtime members who had been part of the church here pretty much since the beginning. And 5 of them, one after the other, they passed away in my first 2 months. We had to do 5 very painful funerals in the first 2 months. So in all of this, I was incredibly stressed, and it was this weird mix of joy and intimidation all at once. And when I think about that time in my life, I think about the fact that what I was really mourning the most, and what really had me the most stressed, was that it was change. It was change. Now, when I get stressed out, or when I need to clear my head, I go to the mountains and I go hiking, or I go skiing or fishing, just something outdoors so I can start thinking clearly again. And unfortunately, Amarillo is out on the plains. There are no mountains to be hiked in near Amarillo. And that's when I discovered a very special place here in this area, and that's the place I want to take you to today as we continue talking. That's Palo Duro Canyon, which is just about 20 minutes from Amarillo. And I remember in those first few months, I would go hiking down there and think about where my life was at that moment. Change is hard. Change requires us to think about and reflect on it. Are any of you at the Ridge stressed out about the change that's about to happen in the next few weeks about this transition? I'll be honest with you, I'm a little nervous about it. Well, if you are, you're in good company, because we find ourselves in this story today with Elijah and Elisha, his protege. And Elijah is nearing the end of his life, and Elisha is nervous about the implications of the change that's happening in his life as Elijah passes on as Elijah passes on. And so every place that they go, the prophets and the people of God, they come out and they greet Elijah and Elisha, and they run up to Elisha, and they all say the same thing. They say, "This is the day. This is the day that God's going to take Elijah from you. Are you ready, Elisha? You ready for this change that's going to happen?" Every time Elisha says the same thing, he just says, "I don't want to talk about this. Oh, I don't want to talk about this." I mean, you can see just in the tone that he's nervous, he's upset. It's not just for the loss of Elijah, it's because change is coming. And change is hard, and transitions are hard. I mean, they remind us that there's so little about our lives that's permanent. So I went to that canyon that first time, when I was so stressed out by the changes that were happening in my life, and the new role I had to play. And I came to that vista where I could look on the whole beauty of the canyon. And as I looked out, it clicked with me that this is exactly what a canyon is. It's change. It's change happening right in front of your eyes. You know, a river flows through the middle of Palo Duro Canyon, and it's carved it and shaped it over the years and formed it, and it scooped out all the earth that's there. And what's left over is this beautiful, opened up space that never would have been there were it not for change. And the change isn't over yet. We can't control it really. We're just in it. waiting to see what God will do next. I mean, no wonder Elisha is so prickly here in this passage. It's the most human thing he could be. And so Elijah and Elisha, they walk on and they cross the Jordan River. It's just the two of them now. And Elijah turns to Elisha and he says, you know, God's going to take me from you today. This is just about to happen, Elisha. So what can I do for you before God does take me from you? I love that moment. Here's Elijah. He's the leader. He's the one that Elisha wants to be like. And even now in these last moments, he's mentoring Elisha. And Elisha, he says this very strange thing. He says, give me a double portion of your spirit. Who does this guy think he is if he thinks he can have twice the spirit of Elijah, this giant of the faith? Does he really think he's twice as great as Elijah? But if you understand Israelite families, then this request, it actually makes perfect sense. Because when a patriarch of a family died, his property, his land and his flocks and everything else that he owned, it was divided among all of his living children. But the oldest son, he would get the largest portion, what was called the double portion. It was actually 2/3 of the whole family estate. And the reason is very simple, because for that oldest son in the Israelite family, it is his job to carry on the family name. It's his responsibility. And so Elisha, when you see this, what he's really asking, what he's really doing is he's wrapped his head around this responsibility. He's wrapped his head around this change that is about to happen. I mean, for everything there is a time and a season. That's what Ecclesiastes says. And you see that when you come to the canyon. When you go to Palo Duro, you can see this. Change is happening all around every day. Every day our lives are changing. Every day the world is changing. And yet God is there in the midst of the change. God is right there in it. I mean, God has sown so much beauty and so much goodness for us to uncover. You walk around Palo Duro Canyon long enough and you can see all the life that's there, the lizards and the turkeys and the trees. You can see all the different strata of soil that have been revealed as erosion has carried away so much. I mean, and in the midst of all of this change, there are things that are thriving. There's life. It's all there because the canyon is a refuge. God's been at work in it, in the midst of change. I think that's what Elisha is starting to figure out too. And so Elisha, he sees this amazing thing happen right before his eyes. And as it does, he cries out, "Oh, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." It's as if this whole day that Elisha has experienced is wreathed in memories of God's past goodness and care. And he takes Elijah's mantle and repeats what Elijah did just moments before. He slaps the water over the Jordan River with the mantle. And just as it did for Elijah, the water parts and Elisha is able to cross back into Israel on dry land. No doubt he remembers other times God delivered people through water. Moses and the children of Israel crossing through the parted waters of the Red Sea, rescued from Pharaoh. Joshua leading the children of Israel into the promised land that the Lord had delivered for them. All these memories shouldn't be lost on us. That God has always been at work in the midst of change and transition. That's pretty much how God very often works. It's how he still works today. In fact, in Palo Duro Canyon, there are places and landmarks in rock formations that veteran hikers and longtime visitors of the park, they can remember them, but they're gone. They have been washed away over the years or eroded down. There's a gorgeous rock formation that I've seen pictures of called the Sad Monkey. There's this big, beautiful rock formation. They even built this little model railroad out to it, a little toy railroad that you could ride out with your family to see this rock formation. But one night in the 70s, they had a torrential rainstorm, and it rained so hard and the water crashed down so heavily that the rock formation collapsed. It even collapsed right on top of the tracks of the railroad. So there is no Sad Monkey anymore, and there is no railroad to ride. People can still remember riding it, but that's all it is. It was lots of fun, but it's just a memory. That's what happens in change. It's not just the renewal, it's also recognition that there's loss involved. And yet, that process of change and erosion is exactly what made the canyon in the first place. Just as it has eroded things that people can remember, it is also unearthing new things and new formations. It is bringing about new places of beauty, new refuges for birds and trees and animals. And those things, too, will eventually change. I think that's what God does with us, too. We're all Elishas walking through life. This change that's coming at the ridge, I am so excited to come to the ridge and to see what God has in store for us. But at the same time, I know that it's also painful, because there's a loss that's part of it, isn't there? I've known Bill Case for several years. I know what a good and caring and faithful pastor that he is. He and his family have been part of the landscape at the ridge right since the beginning. And that's a loss. And yet this is how God works. God is always raising up new Elishas, new people to proclaim his word. And I'm not just talking about myself as the new pastor. I'm not even talking primarily about that. God's going to bring new people to us. God's going to bring us to new places. God is going to weave and orchestrate and change us all along the way, just as the wind and the rain and the water shape and reveal the landscape, because God is faithful even in the midst of change. And so this is my prayer as we move into these next few weeks, that we would greet change and transition not just with acceptance or even with courage, but that we would see God's work in the midst of change, because God is always there with us as our lives change, as the church changes, as the world changes. And my prayer is that we will take up the mantle, just as Elisha did, and that we will continue the good work which has already begun, which began long before we were around. And we'll continue on through the ages, because God has something truly wonderful in store for the ridge and for all of us.